People make a risky assumption when they lie to an empath. They assume empathy means being easily fooled. They assume kindness means blindness. They assume emotional depth somehow weakens perception. But the reality is often the opposite. The very qualities that make an empath caring are often the same qualities that make them extremely hard to deceive. Because empaths are not only listening to words, they are watching patterns. They are reading emotional signals most people miss. They notice the pause before a sentence, the forced smile that comes a second too late, the shift in tone when certain names are mentioned, the mismatch between what someone says and what their body seems to be expressing. And this is where many people misunderstand intuition. They think intuition is something mystical, unclear, or irrational. But much of what we call intuition is actually pattern recognition working below conscious awareness. An empath may not immediately say you are lying. In fact, most of the time they won't. But they feel something is off, something doesn't line up. And that inner signal stays present even when they try to ignore it. Psychologists have long known that human communication works in layers. Words carry one message. Behavior often carries another. Emotional alignment or misalignment reveals a third. Empaths are especially sensitive to misalignment. They can sense when a person's words are trying to run ahead of their truth. And this creates a problem for the person lying because deception usually depends on managing appearances. It relies on controlling the surface. But empaths do not stay only at the surface. They pay attention to what slips through. A manipulative person may think they have hidden the truth because the story sounds believable. But the empath is noticing something completely different. Why did your energy change when that question came up? Why did your confidence turn defensive? Why did your explanation become too detailed? Why does your apology feel practiced instead of genuine? These are not random feelings. These are observations. And here is something even deeper. Empaths often understand pain, guilt, fear, and shame because they have explored those emotions within themselves. They recognize emotional patterns because they have experienced them. That makes deception harder to hide in front of someone who knows what inner conflict looks like. This is why people who lie to empaths often feel frustrated. They feel seen in ways they did not agree to. They sense that their act is not working the way they expected. And sometimes they confuse this with judgment when really it is awareness. Now, this does not mean empaths are never misled. In fact, many empaths remain in dishonest situations far longer than they should, but not because they cannot sense dishonesty. Often it is because they sense it and then silence themselves. They explain it away. Maybe I am overthinking. Maybe they are just under pressure. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe love means giving another chance. And this is one of the deepest inner struggles of the empath, not recognizing truth, but trusting what they recognize. Because many sensitive people have been trained to doubt their own perception, especially if they have experienced gaslighting, manipulation, or environments where truth was often twisted. They may feel the lie immediately, then spend months trying to convince themselves they are wrong about what they already feel. And this is where wisdom comes in, because growth for an empath is not becoming more suspicious. It is becoming more faithful to reality. It is understanding that if someone's words and behavior constantly clash, the clash itself is the truth. If someone repeatedly creates confusion, that confusion is information. If something feels wrong again and again, that feeling deserves attention. This is not fear. This is clarity. And clarity is what turns empathy into strength. Because empathy without clarity can be used against you. But empathy with clarity becomes very difficult to manipulate. And this is where people make their biggest mistake. They think because an empath stays silent, they do not notice. Because an empath does not react right away, they do not understand. Because an empath shows patience, they must be unaware. But often the empath sees much more than they show. They may be observing. They may be waiting. They may be giving you space to tell the truth on your own. Because empaths at their healthiest do not rush to accuse. They watch. They confirm. They allow reality to reveal itself. And reality always reveals itself. Because lies have a weakness. They need constant support. Truth supports itself. Lies require ongoing fixing. And over time, most lies fall apart under the weight of their own contradictions. The empath understands this, even if only on a deeper level. This is why many empaths seem calm in the presence of dishonesty. Not because they are fooled, but because they understand something important. Truth does not need to rush or panic. And there is something almost philosophical about this. A lie is not just false information. It is an attempt to create a false version of reality. And empaths by nature are drawn to authenticity, to what is real beneath the act, to what is emotionally true beneath what is socially acceptable. That is why lying to an empath is so harmful. Because you are not just giving wrong facts. You are breaking the very principle they build connection on, and they feel that deeply, sometimes even before you finish speaking. So when someone lies to an empath, they often believe they are hiding something. But what they may actually be doing is revealing themselves, revealing their fear, revealing their character, revealing the gap between appearance and reality. And eventually the empath sees that gap clearly, not because they are psychic, but because they are attentive. That is the power people underestimate. The empath is not reading minds, they are reading patterns, and patterns rarely lie. So if you think deception protects you from being seen, understand this. You may hide facts for a while. You may delay consequences for some time, but you cannot consistently fake alignment in front of someone shaped by life to notice what does not align. And that is why lying to an empath is never as invisible as you think. Because the first person deception reveals is often the one who is deceiving. And that leaves us with something important to remember. When words and energy do not match, trust the pattern. Truth whispers long before it shows itself. And once deception is sensed, something even deeper begins to unfold. Because with an empath, a lie is rarely taken as just a false statement. It is felt as a crack in the emotional structure of trust. And most people misunderstand what trust really is. They treat trust like a simple social agreement, something casual, something automatic in relationships. But to an empath, trust is much deeper. It is emotional safety. It is the invisible base that allows vulnerability to exist. It is the silent agreement that says what is real between us will be respected. And when that agreement is broken through dishonesty, the damage is rarely about the lie alone. It is about what the lie represents. Because when someone lies to an empath, the pain is not just you gave me false information. The pain is you made me build emotional truth on something false. And that is betrayal. Betrayal is not just disagreement. It is not just conflict. It is not even always wrongdoing. Betrayal is the collapse of trusted reality. And that affects an empath differently because empaths do not connect on a shallow level. They invest through meaning, through emotional alignment, through genuine honesty. So when dishonesty enters that bond, it does not stay on the surface. It spreads through everything the relationship was built on. Suddenly, the empath is not only questioning the lie, they are questioning every moment around it. Was that apology real? Was that promise true? Were those words ever honest? Was I loved sincerely, or was I controlled? And this is where one lie becomes mentally bigger than the event itself. Because deception does something dangerous to the mind. It creates doubt about the past. It makes memories feel uncertain. And when the past becomes uncertain, the nervous system does not treat that as a small issue. It treats it as danger. This is why betrayal often feels traumatic because in many cases it is. The brain reacts to relational betrayal in ways very similar to other forms of emotional harm. There is constant alertness, overthinking, mental loops, difficulty trusting your own judgment. And for an empath, someone already sensitive to emotional undercurrents, this can go very deep. Because what they gave was not casual trust. It was genuine trust. And when that is broken, it often turns into pain. Now this is where many people completely misunderstand the empath. They assume the empath is hurt because they are too emotional, too sensitive, too attached, too idealistic. But that explanation misses the real point. The empath is hurt because they take truth seriously, because they believe honesty matters, because they approach the relationship as something meaningful enough to deserve integrity. And that is not weakness. That is moral depth. In fact, one could say that what makes betrayal painful is exactly what makes trust meaningful. If trust can be broken without consequence, then it never had much value in the first place. And empaths understand this instinctively. That is why even so-called small lies can carry heavy weight. Because an empath is rarely measuring the size of the lie. They are measuring what it shows about character. And this is a difference many people never understand until it is too late. You think the issue was the hidden message. But the real issue was what hiding it communicated, that you chose control over honesty, image over intimacy, protection of self over protection of truth. And that changes how the empath sees you, sometimes permanently. Because once deception shows itself, something shifts. The empath may still care, may still love, may still try to understand, but innocence slowly fades. And innocence once lost is very hard to bring back. This is why repeated lying creates such deep consequences with empaths. Not because they become loudly angry, but because they begin pulling back trust at the level where relationships truly exist. And when trust pulls back, connection turns into performance. Conversations become careful. Vulnerability becomes limited. Presence becomes guarded. The relationship may look fine on the outside, while inside it has already started breaking down. And often the person who lied does not even notice this is happening because they think betrayal is only visible when someone leaves. But many times betrayal becomes visible long before departure. It shows up in emotional distance, in quietness, in less sharing, in the slow closing of access, because an empath, once hurt deeply enough, does not always explode. Sometimes they simply stop opening doors. And that may be the greater consequence, because anger can still be relational. Anger still connects. Silence born from broken trust is something very different. It is disengagement, and that is much harder to repair. Now, there is a deeper truth here worth thinking about. Every lie tries to control perception, but every act of trust is an offering of reality. And when you betray trust, you are not just changing perception, you are dishonoring an offering. That is why betrayal carries moral weight. It violates something human beings need in order to grow together. And empaths, maybe more than most, feel this deeply because they do not just seek connection, they seek alignment. And deception destroys alignment. This is why lying to an empath often creates a result the liar never expected. It does not just reveal dishonesty. It teaches the empath where not to place their heart again. And once someone learns that lesson, access changes forever, sometimes quietly. So, if someone trusts you deeply, if they have given you honesty, emotional safety, vulnerability, understand the responsibility inside that. Do not treat their trust as something strong enough to survive repeated damage, because trust is not usually destroyed in one big moment. It fades through repeated violations, and what fades slowly often disappears without noise. And silence can be the final sign that betrayal has already done its work. This is why lying to an empath is such a serious mistake. Because what you think is a hidden action may become the very thing that reveals you as unsafe. And once a person sees you as unsafe, persuasion rarely rebuilds what integrity could have protected. Because trust is not repaired through explanation. It is repaired through truth, consistently, patiently, again and again. And many people only understand the value of honesty after they have lost someone who respected it. But by then the lesson has turned into consequence. And that leaves us with something important to remember. A lie does not only break facts, it breaks the reality two people were trying to create. And once reality cracks, rebuilding it costs far more than telling the truth ever would. And after betrayal has been seen clearly, after the patterns can no longer be ignored, after trust has been broken, after the empath has struggled internally with doubt, forgiveness, rationalization, and painful clarity, something changes. Not loudly at first, quietly, almost unseen. And this is where people who underestimated an empath often make their biggest mistake. They assume the empath will keep explaining, keep confronting, keep giving more chances, keep coming back to the table to discuss what should have never needed discussion in the first place. But there comes a point where awareness becomes decision. And when that happens, the empath's silence becomes one of the most misunderstood forms of power. Because silence in this situation is not passive. It is not confusion. It is not surrender. It is resolution. And there is a deep psychological shift inside that moment. Before this point, the empath may have used a lot of energy trying to keep the connection alive, trying to understand the other person's reasons, trying to fix what honesty could have prevented, trying to save the relationship through communication. And this is important to understand. Empaths often do not leave at the first sign of betrayal. They stay much longer than most people realize, not because they are weak, but because they believe in repair. Because they tend to see pain behind harmful behavior, because they often see brokenness before they see bad intention, and because they do not give up easily on what they care about. But endurance has limits, and once those limits are reached, the same person who once fought hardest for the connection may become the one who walks away most firmly. This is the part many manipulators never expect, because they have mistaken patience for dependence, compassion for tolerance, understanding for permission, and those are dangerous misunderstandings because what looked like endless acceptance was often measured grace. And grace, once used up, does not always announce that it is leaving. Sometimes it becomes silence. And silence is powerful because it signals something important. The empath is no longer trying to convince you to become honest. They have accepted what you have shown, and acceptance changes behavior. There is no more arguing because arguing assumes the other person is open to truth. There is no more over-explaining because over-explaining often comes when someone still hopes misunderstanding is the issue. There is no more emotional chasing because chasing ends when reality becomes clear. And suddenly the energy that once moved outward toward fixing, saving, understanding, turns inward toward boundaries, toward dignity, toward self-respect. And this is where silence stops being absence and becomes authority, because the empath is no longer reacting to deception. They are responding to truth, and truth has simplified everything. Now, psychologically, this is a powerful shift because manipulators often depend on emotional engagement. Conflict feeds them. Defensiveness feeds them. Repeated explanations feed them. Your need for closure feeds them. But silence removes participation. And when participation is removed, the pattern begins to fall apart. Because many unhealthy relationship patterns need your continued emotional involvement to survive. Silence breaks the system, and that is why it feels so powerful. Not because silence is punishment, but because it is refusal to cooperate with distortion. It is refusal to keep negotiating with what has already been made clear. And there is something deeply thoughtful in this. At some point, wisdom is knowing when more conversation serves truth and when it only extends confusion. That understanding changes lives. Because many people believe strength is found in saying more, explaining better, making one last argument that finally forces the other person to understand. But often, real strength appears when explanation ends because you stop needing your reality confirmed by someone committed to denying it. And that is freedom. This is the realization many empaths eventually reach. I do not have to keep proving what I know. I do not have to beg honesty from someone choosing deception. I do not have to keep reopening wounds searching for closure from the same place that caused the pain. That realization is deeply transformative because it moves the empath from emotional captivity to psychological independence. And once that happens, their silence unsettles people because silence removes access. It removes emotional leverage. It removes the familiar pattern the other person expected to continue. And suddenly, the person who believed they had control realizes that control depended on the empath continuing to engage. But the empath has stopped participating. And that changes everything. Now, to be clear, this is not silent treatment. This is not manipulation through withdrawal. This is not cold behavior for show. This is something far more grounded. It is conscious disengagement. It is refusing to keep giving energy where integrity no longer exists. And there is dignity in that. There is wisdom in that. There is self-respect in that. Because silence at its highest level is not about punishing another person. It is about no longer abandoning yourself. And for many empaths, that may be the greatest lesson of all, because so often they have been taught to choose harmony over truth.